The wind spoke in whispers that morning, sweeping over cracked earth and forgotten fence posts, its voice dry as bone. Sagebrush bent like old men in prayer, and the sky hung low with no promise of rain. Not even the birds called anymore. The prairie had fallen silent in that way it sometimes does, just before something important is about to be found. They rode slow, 3 of them, spread out like cautious spirits drifting across the plain. A rancher from the north led the way. He was the quiet sort, carried the weight of his own silences. Folks didn't know much about him, only that he worked alone, answered slow, and had eyes like dusk, deep and unreadable. Behind him trailed a younger man from town, long-legged and jittery, boots too new for the land he walked on. He kept glancing over his shoulder, spooked by nothing in particular. The third was an old ranch hand, brown as the land itself, who said little but knew the patterns of buzzards in the sky like he knew the veins on his own hands. They hadn't come looking for girls. Truth be told, they weren't sure what they were looking for anymore. 2 days ago, a stray dog had wandered into town with dried blood on its neck and an old ribbon tangled in its matted fur. The preacher's wife had knelt beside it, eyes full of quiet dread. That was enough for a few men to saddle up. The well stood where no well should be, miles from the nearest home, tucked behind the husk of an abandoned barn. The boards had long since grayed and curled, as if the building were trying to forget itself. No tracks led in or out. Just stillness, and a heat that made the skin itch. The quiet man dismounted first. He didn't speak, didn't motion. He just walked toward the well, something in his gait slowing. The others followed, but kept a step back. He knelt, rested his hand on the rim of the stones. Then he listened. At first, there was nothing. Just the dry rasp of wind over dirt. Then, softly, came a sound not born of earth or wind. A child's breath. Ragged. Wet. His body moved before thought could catch it. Rope was uncoiled, tied fast. He lowered himself down into the shadows, dust from the stones falling around him like tiny ghosts. The light narrowed until he vanished into the earth, swallowed by that ancient mouth. When he reached the bottom, he found them. 2 girls. One about 15, the other younger, perhaps 10. The older one was crouched low, arms curled tight around the smaller frame, shielding her with her whole being. Her eyes were open but far off, red-rimmed and dry from crying long past the point of tears. Her lips cracked, her cheeks hollow. Her fingers trembled where they gripped her sister's shirt. The little one's face was turned into her sister's chest. Her skin was cold. Too cold. He didn't speak. He simply laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. She flinched, then blinked. Slowly, she turned her face toward him. Her expression was unreadable, part terror, part wonder, part a kind of ancient resignation that no child should wear. She didn't speak, but her body gave the smallest nod. It took time to lift them. He secured the little one first, wrapping her small limbs gently, as if binding the last piece of glass in the world. The girl above never loosened her grip until the rope went taut. Even then, her hand lingered on her sister's foot as she rose. Then it was her turn. She didn't move much. Her legs had gone stiff from crouching too long. He had to half-carry her into the harness. But she let him. Not because she trusted him, but because something inside her had already broken. When they reached the surface, the sky seemed too wide. The light too cruel. The girl blinked rapidly, one hand shielding her sister's face. The rancher knelt beside them both. No one spoke. There were no words fit for that moment. The younger man from town whispered a curse and looked away. The old hand crossed himself. The rancher stayed still. His gaze never left the girl. They carried the children back, slow, careful, as if they were cradling time itself. The town, such as it was, stirred like a sleeping beast as they approached. A few folks stepped onto porches. A widow clutched her shawl. Someone whispered, "Lord have mercy." At the chapel infirmary, the preacher's wife took over. She had the hands of someone who had buried 2 children and still knew how to soothe a fever. She made no fuss. Just gestured to a cot and began her work. The older girl didn't speak. She sat by the little one's side, one hand wrapped around her sister's fingers. She didn't look at anyone. When water was offered, she took it without thanks. When a blanket was laid over her, she did not flinch. But when someone tried to move her away from the bed, her hand lashed out fast and fierce as a snake. They left her be after that. The man, the one who'd pulled her from the dark, stood in the doorway long after the others had gone. His hat in his hands. Dust on his shirt. He didn't understand what had changed in him, only that something had. He wasn't the kind to linger. But that night, he sat on the porch bench outside the chapel, arms folded, back stiff, watching the wind stir the lantern light. Hours passed. The streets emptied. Still he sat. Inside, the girl didn't sleep. She just watched the rise and fall of her sister's breath, eyes rimmed in flame and shadow. When dawn broke, pink and bruised on the edge of the horizon, the girl finally looked toward the door. Her eyes found him through the cracked wood. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But the weight between them shifted. Slight. Almost nothing. And yet, the world had already begun to turn. By the time the sun climbed high enough to bleach the rooftops, word had already traveled farther than any horse could. It was whispered through flour sacks at the general store, passed behind cupped hands on chapel steps, murmured in the silences between spoonfuls of stew. The girls from the well. Found clutching each other like roots under stone. No one knew where they'd come from, but everyone had a story to tell. In a town as small and weather-beaten as this one, stories mattered more than facts. Facts stayed buried with the bones. But stories, they grew like weeds. Some said the girls were runaways, escaping some outlaw father who'd lost everything at cards. Others claimed the older one had taken the younger and thrown herself into the well on purpose, hoping for death and finding only dust. A widow swore she recognized their faces from a family that passed through 5 years ago, though she couldn't remember the mother's name. The truth didn't matter. It never did, not when mystery walked among them. The older girl had not yet spoken more than a handful of words. She stayed inside the infirmary, sitting beside her sister like a carved stone idol, all bone and silence. The younger one still hadn't stirred, her breath shallow, her body curled like something trying to stay hidden even in sleep. The preacher's wife tended them both with a mother's patience, her voice low and kind, her hands never hurried. And the man, the one who had climbed into the dark and carried them out, he returned every morning without reason. He brought water and firewood, tools to mend the doorframe, jars of preserved peaches that no one had asked for. He never lingered long, never said much, but his presence settled like a weightless stone on the porch, steady and quiet. Children from town crept near the infirmary when no one was watching. They'd hide behind barrels, daring each other to get closer, peeking through the warped glass to catch a glimpse of the ghost girls. One boy swore he saw the older one staring straight at him, eyes black as coal. After that, none of them came close again. Inside, the girl began to move differently. She no longer trembled when the nurse touched her shoulder. She helped sponge her sister's arms with water cooled in a cracked basin. When food was placed nearby, she ate without shame, but always slowly, as if she expected it to disappear before the next bite. Her eyes remained wary, as if trust was a thing she couldn't afford to waste. On the 4th day, she spoke. She was brushing the little one's hair, untangling knots with careful fingers, when she asked, voice low, "Where's the man?" The preacher's wife looked up from folding linens. "Which one?" "The one who brought us out. He's outside. Comes most days. Quiet sort." The girl didn't respond, but her hands paused mid-motion. Later that afternoon, he returned. Dust clung to his boots, and his face looked like it hadn't known sleep in years. He knocked lightly, though the door was open. She didn't look at him, just kept combing. But her shoulders eased, just slightly. He placed a tin of bread biscuits on the windowsill and turned to go. Before he could step off the porch, her voice followed him, soft but unshaking. "What's your name?" He turned, slowly. Thought for a beat too long. "Doesn't matter much. To me it does." He studied her then, really looked, at the bruises still faint along her arms, the way she curled around her sister even when no one was near. And in that moment, he knew she wasn't just trying to survive. She was building walls. He gave her a name, maybe not his first, maybe not his last, but it was the one he wore now. She nodded once, then returned to brushing. The next day, she followed him out to the porch. They sat without words, listening to the breeze scrape across the wood. He offered her a peach from the jar. She took it, licked the syrup from her thumb like she hadn't tasted sweetness in years. Maybe she hadn't. Over the next week, a rhythm found them. He'd arrive before noon, and she'd sit outside while her sister slept. She never smiled, but her silence grew softer. He began showing her things, not by words, but through action. How to check the saddle strap, how to oil a hinge, how to read the sky for signs of weather. She watched closely, her eyes never missing a movement. Sometimes she'd speak in fragments. "One day," she said, "I can sew. Another day, I remember the stars. Then, she sings when she wakes, but only if I'm there." That was all. In town, not everyone was pleased by her staying. The storekeeper, a man who liked his world tidy, muttered often to whoever would listen that strangers brought trouble. He didn't like how the man kept coming either. Said it was unnatural, him watching over her like a ghost shadow. No good ever came from crossing worlds. The preacher disagreed. He said kindness was never unnatural. It was just rare. As the younger sister began to stir, eyes fluttering open one dawn with a hoarse sound like a bird unsure if it should sing, the girl wept silently, face buried in the blankets. Her sister reached for her weakly, their hands tangling like they'd never let go again. That night, the man brought wood carvings shaped like animals. He placed them by the bedside without a word. The little one smiled in her sleep, fingers curled around the tiny horse. The nurse watched all this unfold from the corner. She never interfered, never asked what bound them. But she told the preacher once, in a whisper only meant for God's ears, "I think he's not saving them. I think they're saving him." Winter crept in without a sound. The trees outside the infirmary lost their leaves in a single gust. The wind carried the first snow like it was apologizing for the summer's cruelty. On the day the girl stepped off the porch and asked to ride, the man didn't answer. He simply saddled the second horse. She was stiff, awkward, but determined. She didn't flinch when she mounted. She held the reins like she'd held her sister in that well, tight, terrified, but refusing to let go. They didn't ride far. Just past the edge of town, to where the land rolled soft like sleep. They stopped beside a frozen stream, horses pawing at the frost. She looked out over the fields, arms wrapped around herself. "You think the world wants us?" she asked, voice nearly lost in the wind. He stared at the horizon a long while before replying. "Don't matter what the world wants. Just matters what we hold on to." She nodded, though he wasn't sure she agreed. When they returned, the little sister was sitting upright, watching through the window. She waved, slow and sleepy-eyed. The girl dismounted quickly and ran to her. The man watched her kneel, forehead against the child's, their laughter thin and precious. He didn't follow. That night, as frost crept across the windows, the older girl stepped outside one last time. The air bit sharp, stars bright as shattered glass. She didn't say anything. Just handed him something wrapped in cloth. He opened it to find a scarf, uneven in stitching but made with care. Threadbare yarn in deep red and earth brown. Her voice trembled like a leaf. "She likes you. I can tell." He met her gaze, unsure what to say. There were too many years behind his silence. Too many ghosts. But the scarf in his hands was warm. She stepped back inside, the door clicking softly behind her. And he sat there on the bench, alone in the cold, the scarf in his lap, and the faintest trace of something like hope blooming beneath his ribs. Winter arrived without ceremony, no grand storm, no howling wind to herald it. Just a soft hush that settled over the town like a wool blanket laid gently across a tired body. Ice gathered slow in the corners of window panes, and the color bled from the prairie until everything was gray and still. The streets grew quiet. Folks stayed indoors, their words low, their boots tracked with snowmelt. In the chapel infirmary, the younger girl, no longer a shadow beneath a blanket, laughed for the first time. A breathy sound, small and disbelieving, like she didn't quite trust it belonged to her. She had been sitting up by then, propped with pillows stitched from worn hymnal cloth. Her hands were thin but no longer trembling, her cheeks touched faintly with returning life. Her sister never strayed far. Still protective, still watchful, but now more rooted than brittle. She moved with calm purpose, fetching broth, tucking in quilts, pressing her fingers to her sister's brow with quiet tenderness. She had taken to brushing the little one's hair in the morning and braiding it in the evening, a rhythm that tethered them both. The man came daily, as he always had. But now, his arrival was not just expected, it was part of the day's shape. The sound of his boots on the porch made the younger girl sit a little straighter. The older one, though she never greeted him outright, began to meet his gaze more often, her eyes no longer veiled in suspicion. He brought things with him. A pair of mittens for the little one, carved from old wool and patched with leather. A book with a broken spine but stories intact. A bar of soap that smelled faintly of pine. He never offered explanations. He never lingered to see if the gifts were accepted. But each one found its way into use. He built a sled from leftover timber and tied it with rope. One morning, he left it on the infirmary porch, and the younger sister squealed when she saw it. She dragged it through the fresh snow until her legs gave out, then made her sister pull her back inside, both of them breathless with frost and laughter. The town had softened some. People still watched, but the stares had grown less sharp. The widow from down the lane sent jars of preserved cherries. The blacksmith mended the girl's boots without charge. Even the storekeeper had begun nodding when he passed them in the street, though he always looked away too quickly, like decency embarrassed him. The girl, older now in a way words couldn't measure, began to ask questions. Not many, not fast. But questions that held weight. "Why do you always come?" she asked him once, as they walked toward the woods where the snow was untouched. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, but she didn't fill it. "Finally," he said, "I remember what it's like to need someone and not have them come." She didn't press. But something in her face loosened, like a string pulled gently free. She asked him to teach her to ride better. He did. Patiently. Without praise or correction, just steady guidance and the occasional soft word that steadied her when she faltered. She asked him how to patch torn fabric. He showed her, threading the needle with thick, weathered fingers, never mocking the clumsy attempts she made. And one day, she asked him why he stayed in the town at all, why he hadn't gone east or west or anywhere else. He looked out over the open land, voice low. Because I stopped wanting to leave. He didn't say what had changed. She didn't ask. In the evenings, she would sometimes read aloud from the old book he'd brought. Her voice was steady but hushed, like she feared waking something sacred. The younger girl curled up beside her, thumb in her mouth, eyes wide with wonder. It was during one of these readings, near the end of December, that a knock came at the infirmary door. The girl stiffened. The man, who had just stepped inside with fresh logs, set the bundle down slowly. Standing in the threshold was the preacher. Behind him, a boy no older than 17, soaked to the bone, breath coming hard. His eyes were wild with cold and fear. "They need you," the preacher said. The stranger's boots struck the dirt road with the kind of purpose that made men glance from windows and women pull children close. He walked with the heaviness of someone who believed the world owed him something, and that he'd come to collect it. Dust clung to his coat, but it was the sharpness in his eyes that made folks uneasy. Like he saw everything as a possession that hadn't yet been claimed. He tethered his horse outside the chapel without permission and asked questions without courtesy. 2 girls. Found in a well. Heard they were still breathing. Where might they be? No one answered him straight. The preacher said the girls were under care and that not all wounds were the kind that bled. The widow at the general store said she hadn't seen anything but kindness since they arrived, and maybe that was enough. But the stranger wasn't after kindness. He was after ownership. He made his way to the infirmary by late morning, uninvited and unwelcome, and pushed open the door as if it belonged to him. The little girl, now healthy enough to hum while she colored, looked up and froze. Her chalk dropped to the floor. The older girl stepped between them like instinct, her body tense but steady. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled then, a grin that smelled of old smoke and something fouler. "I got papers," he said. "Your daddy owed me. And when he couldn't pay, he gave me what he had left." She didn't blink. "I'm not property." He reached into his coat, but the man, her man now, though neither of them would yet say it aloud, was already at the door. His voice was soft, but it filled the room. "You're done." The stranger turned, surprised. Then he laughed. "And who are you? She yours now? That it?" The man didn't answer. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on the girl, not the stranger. "Are you afraid?" She looked at him, her chin high, even as her shoulders pressed back against the bed where her sister sat watching. "No," she said. "Not anymore." "Then I'm not either," he replied. The preacher arrived not long after, word having reached him like lightning in dry grass. Behind him came the blacksmith, hands already dusted with coal. A few others stood quietly at the edge of the infirmary porch, not armed, but ready. "This is none of your business," the stranger barked. "I've got a right." The preacher, who had buried more good men than he cared to count, shook his head. "You've got no right to a soul who doesn't choose you. And she's chosen, by blood or by God, I can't say, but it's plain she's not alone anymore." The man stepped between the stranger and the door. "You ride out now," he said. "Or you'll stay and find there's nothing for you here but cold stares and closed doors." For a moment, it looked like the stranger might draw steel. But something in the stillness around him, something in the way no one flinched, broke whatever confidence he had carried in with him. He cursed, spit on the ground, and stormed toward his horse. He looked back once, muttering something too low to matter. Then he was gone, swallowed by the horizon that didn't miss him even a little. Inside, the girl sat slowly. Her knees gave out just as the man reached her, and he caught her without speaking, holding her as if she were made of wind and starlight. She didn't cry. But her fingers clutched the front of his coat like they'd never let go again. Outside, the sky began to change. It started as a hush. The kind of silence the earth holds just before something long-awaited returns. Then the scent, wet, green, and ancient, swept through the street like a forgotten song. Rain. The first drop hit the infirmary roof like a bell. Then another. Then all at once, the sky let go. The townsfolk stepped onto porches, stunned. Some reached out to feel it, as if they weren't sure it was real. Children danced barefoot, faces tilted upward. The dry ground drank greedily. The girl rose, walked to the door, and stepped out without shoes. The rain hit her face, cold and soft. She closed her eyes. Beside her, her sister joined, spinning, arms wide like she could catch the sky. The man stood behind them both, not reaching, not leading, just there. She turned, soaked through, and looked at him. "You stayed," she said. "Even when you didn't have to." He nodded, the rain running in rivulets down his brow. She took a step closer. "I don't want to be saved anymore." He swallowed. "Then what do you want?" "To live. Here. With you. If you'll have us." His breath hitched, not from surprise, but from the weight of hope landing hard in the chest of someone who'd forgotten how to carry it. "I've been waiting for something to matter again," he said. "And now? Now it does." The little one shrieked with laughter, slipping and falling into the mud. The older girl ran to her, scooped her up, and both of them laughed until they couldn't breathe. The man watched them, his heart quiet but full. Later, as the sky dimmed and the air filled with the scent of wet cedar and soil, the townsfolk returned to their homes, one by one. The rain eased into mist, and the world exhaled. In the stillness, beneath a sky finally washed clean, the man sat on the infirmary porch with the girl beside him. Her hand found his. "You know," she said, "the well didn't just take from us. No? No. It gave you to us." He looked out over the land, watched the way the water pooled in the ruts of the old wagon trail. "Some things you find at the bottom of the dark," he said. "You don't always know their light until you carry them out." She leaned against him then, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. And for the first time in many winters, he felt warm all the way through. And so it was, quietly, without thunder or triumph, that they began again. No vows. No names carved into stone. Just a man, two girls, and the sound of new rain falling on old earth. Sometimes, stories don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, they just need to be true. The girl rose at once. The man followed. Across town, a horse had fallen through the ice. A child trapped beneath. It was not the kind of thing most would respond to in such cold, but the man did not hesitate. He tied a rope around his waist, gave the other end to the girl, and stepped out onto the groaning pond without a word. She held that rope like her life depended on it. When he returned, soaked and shivering, the boy was safe, though coughing hard. The man said nothing of his effort. But later, when the girl handed him dry clothes, her hands lingered at his sleeve. "You could have drowned," she whispered. He only looked at her. "You didn't let go. Neither did you." She made him soup that night. The broth was thin and simple, but it warmed them both. By January, the infirmary had become a second home. The younger girl no longer coughed at night. She'd taken to drawing with a stub of charcoal on paper scraps. Her sketches were simple: horses, flowers, a girl with long braids, but one day she handed the man a drawing without a word. It showed 3 stick figures. 2 tall, 1 small. All holding hands. He stared at it longer than he should have. "Spring will come soon," the older girl said later, as they watched smoke curl from the chapel's chimney. The snow had begun to melt in patches. He nodded. "It always does." She looked at him, long and deep, and said, "Not for everyone." There was no need to explain. Some winters lasted years inside a person. The scarf she had made him was still around his neck. Frayed now, a little faded, but worn like armor. One morning, she stood outside waiting before he arrived. Her breath misted in the air. Her hair was tied back neatly, her boots laced with care. "I want to help," she said. "Not just survive." He studied her face, the way her jaw tensed, the resolve that lived behind her eyes. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a key. "To the shed behind the chapel. Tools, lumber, things that need fixing. Yours if you want them." She took the key like it was a jewel. Later that day, the sound of hammering echoed through the town. Rhythmic, strong, certain. By the week's end, she had repaired the chapel step, patched the fence around the infirmary, and built a cradle from scrap wood, just because her hands needed something to do. The man sat beside her once while she sanded the edges. "You don't have a baby," he said. She shrugged. "Maybe someone will." When he looked at her then, he didn't see the girl from the well. He saw someone who had taken her broken pieces and built something solid from them. As the last snow melted and the birds returned, the man noticed something he hadn't before. The porch where he once sat alone was now a gathering place. The little one would run and tumble in the dirt, her laughter scattering clouds. The older girl would sit beside him, back straight, eyes clear. She no longer needed watching over. She had grown into something more than rescued. But peace is never left untested. One evening, as golden light slipped behind the hills, a stranger rode into town. Dust-streaked, sour-faced, eyes like a crow. He dismounted slow, head tilted, gaze scanning the streets like he already owned them. He asked about 2 girls. Said he was kin. Said he had a right to them. The townsfolk stood still. And somewhere deep inside the man who had climbed down into a well, something old and cold stirred again. The girl stood in the infirmary doorway, watching the stranger. She didn't speak. But her hand found her sister's shoulder and held it firm. Outside, the wind paused, listening. And the story turned its face toward its reckoning.